The obsidian floor of the trial chamber had known 32 failures in as many nights. I had watched each one with the same stillness I kept for every duty the throne demanded of me, hands behind my back, jaw level, my face giving nothing to the council members who stood in their carved alcoves and waited for proof that the bloodline could be matched, that the seal would wake, that the Valthorn line had a future beyond me. It had not woken, not once, not for a duke's daughter with wolf gold eyes, not for the chieftain's granddaughter who had trained her whole life for this moment and wept when nothing happened. The seal lay in the floor where my founder had set it 400 years ago, a disk of pure obsidian, 2 feet wide, its face carved with the interlocking wolves of Valthorn, and it slept like something that had forgotten it was ever meant to wake. My counselor, Beryl, had taken to standing at my left shoulder during the trials and exhaling through his nose at a frequency that I found deeply irritating. On the 33rd night, he did it again before I had even descended the stairs. "The blood moon is 9 nights away, my lord." "I know how many nights away the blood moon is, Beryl. If the seal does not name a luna by that night." I know the terms of the founding charter. I kept my voice level. I had memorized those terms when I was 12 years old, standing in the same chamber with my father's hand on my shoulder. The Valthorn throne right holds only so long as the seal names a living luna within the Alpha King's reign. Should a blood moon pass with no naming, the throne right expires and the Citadel's wardship reverts to the Council of Lords. A polite way of saying the house my ancestors had built from black stone and centuries of service would pass out of our hands entirely. Bring the woman. The 33rd candidate was a chieftain's niece from the lowland packs, well-dressed, composed, and frightened in a way she was working hard to conceal. I respected that. She crossed the chamber floor on steady feet, knelt at the seal's edge as the ceremony required, and pressed both palms flat to its surface. Nothing. The obsidian stayed dark. My wolf, who had stirred not once through 32 trials, did not stir now either. He simply sat in the back of my chest like a stone and watched. The woman rose with great dignity. I thanked her as I thanked all of them. She left without looking at me, and I did not blame her. Beryl exhaled through his nose. 8 nights, he said. 7, I said, and walked out. The Valthorn citadel was built into the mountain's face, and on cold nights, which were most nights at this elevation, the stone corridors ran with a breath that came up through the floor itself, as though the keep were breathing. I had grown up in those cold halls. They did not bother me. I walked them after the failed trial as I often did, not toward my chamber but simply through the citadel, because motion was easier than sitting with the weight of 9 nights. I passed the lower corridor, the one that ran below the great hall, where the torch sconces sat lower on the walls and the passage was barely wide enough for 2 people abreast. It was a servant's route, not a lord's route, and I had walked it all my life precisely because no one expected me there. I was not expecting anyone there either when I turned the corner and nearly walked into the small figure of a woman, carrying a torch in each hand, and a third tucked under her arm in the particular way that suggested she had made this journey more times than she could count. We both stopped. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, and she wore the gray work dress of the keep's serving staff, the hem dusty from the stone stairs that led up from the torch room. Her hair was pinned back practically, a few strands loose at her temple from what I gathered was a long evening of work. She had, I noticed, a small burn mark on the back of her right hand from some earlier torch mischance, healed to a pale scar, and her eyes, when they came up to mine in the low light, were a very dark brown, startled, then quickly composed. She dipped her head. "My lord, apologies, I was taking the service route to save time. I'll take the outer passage." "You'll freeze on the outer passage," I said. "It's fine, carry on." She looked uncertain, not frightened, simply unused to being told to carry on by the Alpha King in a narrow corridor at this hour. Then she dipped her head again and slipped past me, and I caught, for just a fraction of a second, the scent of pine resin and warm stone, and something else that I did not have a name for, something that stopped my wolf mid-breath. The way a sound stops you when you can't be certain you heard it. I turned back, but she had already rounded the far corner and the corridor was empty. I stood there for a moment. Strange, I said to no one in particular and went to bed. She was called Urin. I found this out the next morning not through any particular inquiry, but because she was the one who left the new torch in the bracket outside my study, and she had left it crooked. It listed about 15 degrees to the left, and I asked the keeper of the household staff, Merritt, who had put it in, and Merritt said without looking up from her ledger, Urin. She's been managing the trial chamber torches all month. She'll have had a long night. See that she straightens the bracket when she has a chance. Yes, my lord. That was all. I did not think about her again that day. I had 8 nights left. The 34th candidate was a border pack's eldest daughter, and she lasted less than 10 seconds at the seal before the nothing became obvious. My wolf did not move. I thanked the woman and walked out again, and Beryl fell in at my elbow and said 7 nights before I could cut him off. I ate alone. I read the founding charter again, not because I expected to find an interpretation I had missed, but because the specific weight of 400 years of obligation was easier to carry when I was holding the actual document. The charter was precise on one point that the council preferred not to dwell on. The Bloodline seal did not recognize bloodlines trained or performed or volunteered. It recognized a single thing, the living carrier of the Valthorn founder's own line, which meant, according to the oldest accounts, that the Alpha King's true fated mate carried that blood, which meant the blood was somewhere, which meant she was somewhere. Or she had died 4 centuries ago without an heir, which was the outcome the council increasingly accepted as a polite way of saying the throne was about to pass out of my hands. I put the charter down. I was a practical man. I did not blame the seal for being what it was. I blamed nothing and no one. But I had been king for 11 years, and in those 11 years I had watched this citadel run on the quiet, careful labor of people the lords never looked at, and I was beginning to think that if the founder's bloodline had spent 400 years surviving, it would have done so in the way difficult things survive. Quietly, in the background, in a servant's corridor with a torch tucked under one arm. This was not a rational conclusion. It was the sort of thought a man has when he has read the same charter too many times and is running short on nights. I went to bed. The 35th trial was on the 6th night before the blood moon. Another failure. The 36th on the 5th night. On the 4th night I dismissed the chamber early. The woman that evening had been openly weeping before she reached the seal, from nervousness and the pressure her family had placed on her, and I would not put her through it. I thanked her myself and told Beryl to see that she was escorted home with full courtesy and a formal gift from the house. He looked at me as though I had suggested something bizarre, and I let him. 3 nights, 2 women remaining on the council's list, and then the list was empty. I told myself that if it came to that, I would find a way to negotiate the charter's terms. Valthorn had negotiated worse. But I was not a man who found it easy to lie to himself, and somewhere under the practical self-possession I had been trained from birth to maintain, there was a king who had stopped, in the past week, believing the seal would ever wake for anyone, who had started to count what he would lose and refused to flinch at the number. On the 3rd night before the blood moon, I could not sleep. I was in my study at some late hour, past midnight I judged, from the quality of the cold, reviewing correspondence I had already reviewed, when I heard from somewhere below a sound. Not a crisis sound, not a shout or an alarm. It was more like an intake of breath. The way a hall sounds when something unexpected happens, and everyone forgets to speak. Then the light came. I know no better way to describe it. Through the stone floor, through the walls of the corridor outside my study, through the narrow gap under the door, a light, white and clean and unlike any torch or lantern I had ever seen. And with it, from the back of my chest, from wherever my wolf had been sitting in stone silence for 32 failed trials and 11 years of a reign, my wolf stood up. Not slowly, not cautiously. He stood up the way a man stands when he hears his name called after years of silence. And on the back of my right hand, in the old scar line I had carried since I was 3 years old, the mark my father had said meant nothing, that the Valthorn kings didn't carry mate marks anymore, that the bloodline had moved past such things, that line split open in light. I was already out of my chair. The trial chamber was 4 corridors and 2 flights of stairs below my study, and I covered the distance at a pace that I recognized distantly as undignified for a king. I did not care. My hand was burning not in pain, but in the way that a limb feels when sensation returns to it after a long absence, the way a cold room feels when someone opens the door to a warm hall. It was that feeling, translated into light. I took the last corner at a near run, and came through the trial chamber's iron-banded door. The chamber was white. Not firelight white, not torch white. The seal in the obsidian floor was blazing from within the stone itself, a pure cold silver light that had no smoke and no heat and no rational source, that reflected off the chamber's black walls and the vaulted ceiling and the iron sconces, and the 2 torches that had been set in the brackets flanking the seal's alcove. Beside the seal, on one knee on the floor, her right hand pressed flat to the obsidian face of it, was Urin. She had not intended to be there. I understood this immediately, because she was still holding a torch in her left hand. She had not even set it down, and her posture was that of someone who had caught herself mid-fall. Her weight was low, one knee on the ground, her free arm still extended, and the expression on her face as she turned to look at me was not triumph or awe or the trained composure of a woman who had practiced for this moment. It was sheer bewilderment. "My lord," she said, and her voice was steady, which I thought was remarkable given that the floor beneath her was generating enough light to read by. I tripped on the step. I reached out to stop myself, and she looked down at the seal, up at me, back down. "I don't know what I've done." "You haven't done anything wrong," I said. My own voice was very quiet. I could still feel my hand, though the light had dimmed slightly. The seal was not blazing at its peak anymore, more like a very deep glow, as though it had discharged the first shock and now sat in a state of ready warmth. "Can you lift your hand?" She lifted it. The glow faded to a low ember pulse. She looked at her palm. Nothing marked it, no burn, no scar, no sign at all that she had just woken an object that had slept for 4 centuries. She looked at my hand. The mark on the back of it was fully visible, a line of silver-white light, branched at the wrist, fine as a traced vein, the mate mark that the old records described but that no Valthorn king had carried in living memory. I watched her look at it. I watched her face work through something careful and serious and frightened, and then come to a kind of stillness on the other side of it. "I don't understand what that is," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm going to explain it to you, but first, what is your full name?" "Urin," she said. "Just Urin, I don't have a house name." "How long have you been in the citadel?" "Since I was 6 years old. My mother brought me here when she came to work. She died 4 years later." She paused. "I've been in the household staff since I was old enough to be useful." "Do you know anything about your mother's family, her line?" She shook her head slowly. "She never spoke of it. I asked once when I was young. She said the name was old and better forgotten." She looked at the seal again, at the low ember glow that still pulsed faintly under the obsidian. "Is this about my family?" "I think it may be," I said. "I'd like to speak with you. Not here, not now, it's the middle of the night. Tomorrow morning in my study. Will you come?" She looked at me with those steady dark eyes for a long moment. Then she said, very simply, "Yes, my lord." I walked her to the servants' passage myself. I did not examine why. I did not sleep that night. I went back to my study and I sat for a long time with my marked hand resting on the desk, looking at the line of silver light that pulsed there, faint now, barely visible, but steady, the way a candle is steady behind glass. In all of my life, I had been trained to approach every difficulty with the same measured practicality. Name the problem, assess what could be known, act on what could be changed, release what could not. It had served me well as a king. It had served me poorly in the hours after midnight when the difficulty in question was a line of silver light on the back of my hand, and a dark-eyed woman kneeling by a blazing seal with a torch in her left hand and genuine bewilderment on her face. I went to the archive room instead. Valthorn's archive occupied 3 chambers below the Great Hall, filled with records that predated my grandfather's grandfather, some going back to the founding. I had read most of it at one point or another, not systematically, but in the way a person reads old records when they have the weight of them pressing on them and too much time to read. I knew where the founding accounts were kept. I found the older records by feel and by lamplight, pulling the flat cases from their shelves until I found the one labeled in a hand I did not know. Bloodline Notes, Valthorn First Generation, restricted to the Alpha King. There were 4 folios inside. I read them all before dawn. Urin arrived at my study door the next morning with the quiet precision of someone who had been told a specific time and intended to meet it. She was in the same work dress as the night before, or one identical to it, and she had her hands folded in front of her with a composure that I had already come to recognize as her natural state rather than a performance of it. I offered her the chair across from my desk. She sat without hesitation. "I was in the archive last night," I said. "Until dawn, I want to tell you what I found." She nodded. The bloodline seal was set in that floor by my ancestor, the founder of Valthorn, 400 years ago. The founding accounts describe it in some detail. It responds to one specific bloodline, his own. The account says he designed it this way because he believed the Alpha King's true fated mate would always carry that line, that he and his Luna were the origin of something specific, and that in every generation of Valthorn kings, the right mate would carry a thread of that original blood, no matter how far it had traveled. The seal would find her. Urin was very still. 400 years, she said, and it never woke. Not once, in my reign or the 3 before mine. The council's position has been that the bloodline is extinct, that whatever heirs the founder's Luna might have carried have died out. But last night it woke. I leaned forward slightly. The founding account also describes the mate mark. The Alpha King of Valthorn was supposed to carry it, a mark that would appear when the seal named his Luna. It's described in detail, the shape of it. I turned my hand over on the desk, the back of it upward. The mark was not blazing now, as it had been in the chamber. In daylight it was more like a fine silver scar. The same line, the same branched pattern at the wrist, visible only if you knew to look for it, and only in certain light. Urin looked at it for a long time. "Your mother said the name was old and better forgotten," I said carefully. "Do you know what the name was?" She was quiet for a moment, then, "Varath," she said it once, only once. "She told me not to use it." She looked up. Is that a name I should know?" I had found it in the 4th folio, in a hand that was older than the others, in a section labeled the Luna's line. What became of it? The founder had known, apparently, that the blood might need to disappear for a time. He had written provision for it, a secondary record, a name that the Luna's heirs were told to set aside, to protect it from the politics that would inevitably surround it. The name was Varath. The instruction was clear. Let it be forgotten, so that it may be found again when the seal needs it. "It's the name of the Valthorn founder's Luna," I said. "Her family name. The one the founding account says her children were told to set down and keep secret, so that no one could use them as political pieces in the line of succession." The stillness in the room was very complete. "So," Urin said after a long moment, My mother's family. Yes. She let out a slow breath. Not a breath of wonder or of fear or of ambition. It was the breath of someone absorbing a very large piece of information and deciding, with great deliberateness, what to do with it. You're certain? I'm not certain of anything yet, I said. The archive gives a thread. The mark confirms something. I paused. The seal itself is fairly definitive. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but its precursor. Yes, she said. I suppose it is. I want to have the archive records examined by my head archivist, Doran. He is the most methodical scholar in this keep, and if there is any gap in the chain of descent, he will find it. I would also like to speak with you further, at whatever pace is comfortable for you. There is nothing I need from you urgently. The blood moon is in 3 nights, but I want you to understand that I intend nothing by this that you have not agreed to. Whatever the seal says, whatever the archive confirms, you are not obligated to anything. She looked at me steadily. You're an Alpha King 3 nights from losing your throne right, she said. That seems like urgency to me. I won't pretend the timing is comfortable, I said, but I mean what I said. I won't ask you for anything on the basis of necessity. That's not the kind of king I intend to be. The look she gave me after that was long and considered and impossible to read fully. Then she said, I would like to speak with Doran, and I would like time today to think. You have it, I said, both. She stood and moved toward the door, and then she stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at me. My lord, the mark on your hand, does it hurt? No, I said. And then, because honesty seemed appropriate in a room that had already held this much of it, it feels like something I'd forgotten I was missing. She nodded once, very carefully, and went out. Doran was the kind of archivist who was happiest when he had a genuinely difficult problem in front of him, and the problem I handed him that morning was the most difficult he had ever had. Traced the Valthorn Luna's bloodline from 400 years ago to a keep servant named Urin who had been in the Citadel for 19 years and could remember only a single word of her family history. He took the brief with an expression that I recognized, in another context, as joy. He emerged 12 hours later with ink on both hands and a stack of documents that he laid on my desk, with the care of a man, presenting something irreplaceable. She is Verath, he said without preamble. 3rd generation removal from the direct line, then 3 generations of lateral descent through a sister branch that moved into service households in the lower keeps. The name was dropped in the 2nd generation, as the founding account specifies should happen. But the records are there, baptismal records, service ledgers, one land transfer record from 60 years ago that carries a marginal notation in old script. The chain is intact. He paused. The founder apparently anticipated that the record would be buried. He left indexing marks in the original folio that I would never have noticed if I hadn't known what I was looking for. He wanted it found, just not easily. He was a thorough man, I said. He was an extraordinary man, Doran said. And so is she, if she'll pardon an archivist saying so. I sat with the documents for a long time after he left. The chain of descent was not the part I kept returning to. It was the last entry in the old folio, the 4th one, in the founder's own hand, the section he had titled For the King Who Finds Her. She will not know who she is. That is by design. The blood protects itself by forgetting. If you are reading this, she has already proven what she is. The seal named her before any scholar or council or king could interfere with the naming. Trust that. Do not let anyone tell you the seal was wrong. The seal is the only honest thing in the room. I closed the folio. I went to find Urin. She was in the lower corridor again, not carrying torches this time, but sitting on the stone bench that ran along the inside wall, a section of old rope braiding in her hands that she seemed to be doing purely to keep her hands occupied while she thought. She looked up when she heard me on the stairs and did not stand, which I found, absurdly, a relief. I sat on the bench at a respectful distance and told her what Doran had found. She listened without interrupting. She had a way of listening that was total. Her attention did not wander. She did not rush to conclusions, and when I finished, she sat with it quietly for a moment before she spoke. I always assumed my mother didn't tell me about her family because there was nothing worth telling, she said. I thought we were simply no one. You were protected, I said, intentionally, by someone who loved your line enough to hide it. She turned the section of rope in her hands. What does it mean for me, practically? What are you? What would you need to ask of me? I had been thinking about how to answer this honestly for the past several hours. 3 nights from now, the Council of Lords is gathering for the final trial before the blood moon. The charter requires a formal naming. The seal must recognize her in the presence of witnesses by that night. If it doesn't, the throne right passes to the council. What happened last night was real, and I believe it, and Doran's records confirm what it means. But the charter requires a formal public naming. So you need me in the trial chamber. Yes, in front of the council, in front of the lords. I paused. I know that's not a small thing to ask of someone who came to the Citadel at 6 years old as a servant's child and has never been introduced to a lord in her life. She was quiet for a moment. What happens to the Citadel if the throne right passes? The lords take wardship. The staff are in no danger. The Citadel continues to function, but it passes out of Valthorn hands. And you? I remain Alpha King by blood, but without the charter's throne right, the title is, I considered, lighter. She looked at me. You care about this Citadel. I have cared about it every day of my life. So have I, she said very simply. In a different way, in a smaller way. She set the rope braiding down on her knee. I'm not afraid of standing in a room with lords, she said. I've been invisible in rooms with lords for 19 years. I suspect this is different, but I'm not afraid. No, I said, watching her. I didn't think you were. I want to read Doran's records myself, she said. All of them. I want to see my mother's family in them. I'll arrange it. He'll sit with you as long as you need. She nodded slowly. All right, she said. I'll do the formal naming. There was something I had been holding back for practical reasons. For the reason that there were enough large pieces of information to absorb already, and I had not wanted to add to the weight of what she was already carrying. But sitting beside her on that cold stone bench, with the torchlight running along the old corridor wall and my marked hand resting on my knee, I found I did not want to be incomplete with her. She deserved the whole picture. There's one more thing, I said. The mark on my hand. The founding account describes it in detail, not just that it appears, but what it means. It's a mate mark, not a bond of obligation, not a political alliance. The account says, I stopped because it was strange to say and then said it anyway, because strange or not, it was true. It means the seal did not simply recognize your bloodline. It recognized you as my fated mate. The corridor was very quiet for a long moment. That's the other part of this, I said. I'm not telling you because I expect anything. I'm telling you because you deserve to know all of what happened last night. She was looking at my hand, at the silver mark that was just visible in the corridor's dim light. Do you believe that, she said, fated mates? A week ago, I said, I would have told you I was uncertain. I believed in the seal because I couldn't argue with 400 years of family record. I was less certain about what it meant beyond bloodline. I looked at my hand myself. After last night, I'm less uncertain. I felt something, she said quietly. When my hand was on the seal, before the light, I felt something. I didn't have a word for it. I thought I was simply frightened. It may have been both, I said, fear and something else at once. The account suggests the bond doesn't announce itself cleanly. She seemed to sit with that for a while, turning it over the way she turned everything over fully, without rushing. I'm not afraid of that either, she said at last. I just need time to understand it. You have it, I said, all the time in the world. The naming and the bond are not the same thing. One is a ceremony, the other takes whatever time it takes. She looked at me then, directly, steadily, and I had the sense, again, of a person who was precisely as she appeared, with no performance and no armor, which after 11 years of councils and lords and people who never said the plain thing was a more startling quality than the blazing seal had been. "You're very careful," she said, "not to push." "I have been told," I said, "that this is one of my better qualities." The precursor of a smile made it fully across her face this time. It was a quiet smile, and it suited her. The 2 days that followed were not what I had expected, and I had not been expecting very much. Urin sat with Doran for most of the first morning, and emerged with the stack of records held carefully in both hands and a look on her face that told me she had found something in them that mattered. She said, when I passed her in the archive corridor, that her mother's family had been in this region for at least 6 generations, and that she thought she recognized her grandmother's surname in a land transfer record, and that it was strange and also good to know it. She continued her work in the Citadel. I did not ask her to stop. I did not see why she should, but I did ask Merritt to reassign her from the trial chamber torches to the archive corridor, on the basis that the trial chamber had served its purpose and the archive corridor was warmer. Merritt agreed without comment. We spoke twice more in those 2 days, both times in my study and both times in the evening, when the Citadel was quieter. She asked me about the founding account, about the charter, about what the Blood Moon Night would involve practically. She wanted to know the steps, the order of things, what she would be expected to say and do. I gave her every detail she asked for. She did not ask to be excused from anything. On the second night she said, before she left, "May I ask you something personal?" "Yes," I said. "Did you ever expect to find her, your fated mate, before last week?" I thought about it honestly. "I expected it less and less as the years passed," I said. "By the time the council began pressing me to exhaust the candidate lists, I had mostly stopped expecting it and started simply doing what the charter required." "And now?" "Now," I said, "I'm sitting in my study at night discussing the Founder's Archive with a woman who woke a 400-year-old seal by accident while carrying a torch, and I find that it is the most natural conversation I've had in a very long time. So I think my expectations have been revised." She held that for a moment. "I've never had much occasion to expect anything," she said. "Growing up here in the household staff, you learn to be practical about the future. You plan for what is likely, not for what would be extraordinary." She paused. "So this is," she seemed to search for the word, "this is very new." "Yes," I said, "for both of us." She looked at me with those steady dark eyes. "I think I'd like to know you better," she said, "as a beginning." It was a simple sentence. I had been told remarkable things in that study by counselors and ambassadors and lords of every standing, and none of them had landed with the particular weight of that one. "That," I said, "seems like an excellent beginning." On the morning of the blood moon, Beryl came to my study at an hour so early that it was still dark and said, in the rapid tone of a man who had been worrying all night, "My lord, the Council of Lords arrives this evening, 12 of them as required by the Charter. They expect the 28th candidate, the merchant lord's daughter from the Eastern Reach, to be presented at the trial. I have to advise you that presenting an alternative, particularly a member of the household staff, without nobility, without a wolf. I know what you have to advise me, Beryl. The lords will object, loudly. There are 3 on that council who have been angling for the wardship question to resolve in their favor for the past 2 years. They will say the seal cannot have woken. They will say the timing is too convenient. They will say all of those things," I agreed. "And then we will show them Doran's records, and then Urin will place her hand on the seal, and then we will not need to say anything further." I looked at him. "I've handled difficult councils before, Beryl. You've never presented a keep servant, as the Alpha Kings fated Luna before." "That's true," I said. It's a new experience. I find I'm not particularly troubled by it." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, in a different tone, less the counselor's tone, more the tone of the man who had served my father and knew me at 14, "Is this certain?" "Yes," I said. He exhaled through his nose. "Then I'll prepare the chamber." I went to find Urin before the lords arrived. She was in the lower corridor. Of course she was. She seemed to find the lower corridors genuinely comfortable, and I was beginning to understand why. They were the part of the citadel that had nothing to do with politics, and she was sitting on the bench again, very still, looking at nothing in particular. She looked up when she heard me. "Are they here?" "Coming this evening, 2 hours approximately." I sat down across from her. "How are you?" She thought about it. "I'm all right," she said. "I'm not afraid of the lords. It's strange, knowing that people will look at me tonight in a way they haven't before. I've been in that great hall 100 times. I've cleared the plates from their tables." She paused. "I know what they'll think when I walk in." "They'll think it's impossible," I said, "and then the seal will show them that it isn't." "And after that?" "After that," I said, "they'll think what the seal tells them to think. The charter is very clear on that point. The seal's naming is final and binding. Whatever their private opinion, they cannot argue with the charter's own mechanism." She nodded slowly. "I want to wear my work dress," she said. I had half expected that. "That's your right. I thought you might suggest something else. What you wear is your decision entirely. But I want you to know, if you want something else provided, or if you'd prefer anything at all to be different about tonight, tell me and it's done." She shook her head. "I've been in this citadel for 19 years in this dress," she said. "I don't want to walk into that hall as something I'm not. If the seal names me in it, then this is what the seal's Luna looks like." I looked at her quiet, steady composure, at the burned scar on the back of her hand, at the dark eyes that had never been anything other than entirely themselves. "Yes," I said, "it is." She stood, smoothed the gray work dress with the backs of her hands, a practical gesture, automatic, which somehow I found I would not have traded for anything more rehearsed. "Then let's go meet your lords," she said. The great hall of Valthorn's citadel held 12 lords that evening, arranged in the tiered alcoves that ran along both walls. They had come expecting the presentation of a merchant lord's daughter, and the almost certain confirmation that the blood moon would pass with no naming. Several of them, I suspected, had already begun to draft their charter claim documents. They did not expect to see me walk in beside a young woman in a gray work dress. I felt the change in the room before anyone spoke. A shift of weight, a collective straightening, a silence that had a particular quality, the silence of people recalibrating very quickly and not quite completing the recalibration before the next thing happened. Beryl, to his credit, handled the introduction without flinching. "The Alpha King presents, by right of the Bloodline seal, a candidate for the formal trial. Urin, of the Valthorn Keep household of the line Verath." The name hit the room the way I expected it to. Lord Keed, the one who had been most vocal about the wardship question, leaned forward from his alcove. "Verath," he said, and his voice had a very specific tone, the tone of someone who had done enough archive work to know the name meant something and was not yet sure what. "That name hasn't been spoken in this hall in 400 years," I said. "Doran's records establish the chain of descent. They are on the table at the room's far end. You're welcome to examine them at any point." I paused. "Or we can proceed to the seal." A brief taut silence. "The charter is clear," I said, not raising my voice. "The trial is the seal's naming. Everything else is commentary." No one objected outright. Several looked as though they wanted to. We moved to the trial chamber. The chamber was cold, as it always was. The 12 lords arranged themselves in the alcoves, and Beryl took his position by the door, and I stood at the chamber's far edge. Urin walked to the seal without being told to. She knew the chamber. She had spent a month tending its torches, and she did not look at the lords. She looked at the seal. She crouched down, the way she had crouched the night she tripped, low, easy, without ceremony, and she pressed her palm flat to the obsidian face. The hall went white. It was not the tentative blaze of the first night, the shock of a first contact, the discharge of something that had been held too long. This was the seal at full response, full, deliberate, certain, the way a key sounds different in a lock when it belongs there. The light poured up through the obsidian and across the floor and up the walls and into the vaulted ceiling, and it was so completely without smoke or heat or any rational source that even the lords who had been skeptical went entirely still. My mark blazed on the back of my hand. I did not look at it. I was looking at Urin. She had not moved. Her palm was flat on the seal and her eyes were closed, and she was kneeling in a pool of white light with her gray work dress and her pinback hair and her composure. And in the blazing of that ancient, utterly honest mechanism she looked. There is only one word for it. She looked exactly as she was. Not costumed, not elevated, not transformed into something she hadn't been before. She looked exactly as she was, which the seal was making plain was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Lord Keed spoke first, which surprised me. I had expected him to be the last. He said in a strange voice, hushed, "The seal." "Yes," I said. "It named her." "Yes." Another silence. The light was still running across the walls, slowly ebbing now, the way a deep bell slowly stops ringing without ever quite becoming silence. Urin opened her eyes. She lifted her hand from the seal. She looked around the chamber, at the lords, at Beryl, at me, with the same clear, undefended gaze she had given me in the lower corridor when I first told her what her mother's name meant. I crossed the floor. Not quickly. I did not want to crowd her, did not want to overwhelm what was still her moment to find her footing in. I stopped in front of her, and I took my royal cloak from my shoulders, the heavy gray wool with the Valthorn wolves at the collar, and I placed it around hers. She looked up at me. The light was still in her eyes from the seal, or perhaps it was simply the torchlight, and I was looking for things that weren't there, and I found that I was not, in that moment, a king performing a ceremony. I was a man standing in front of the woman he had been too practical to look for, and she was looking back at him, and there was nothing between them but the cloak and the truth. "Urin of the line Verath," I said, "for the lords and the charter and the 400 years of obligation. The seal of Valthorn names you Luna." And then, because the charter required the formal proclamation but the moment required something more honest. "And I am glad," I said, quietly enough that perhaps only she heard it, "that you tripped on the step." Her smile came fully then, not the precursor, not the edge of it, but the whole thing, warm and surprised and entirely real. And it was better than the blazing seal, and it was better than any number I could have put on it. Behind us, in the alcoves, 12 lords were doing what the charter's mechanism left them no choice but to do. They bowed. The blood moon rose over the citadel that night in the particular red gold of its kind, the sky the color of old bronze, the mountains black stone against it, the citadel's towers catching the light from below. I stood on the moonlit rampart after the lords had gone to their rooms, after Beryl had compiled a record of the formal naming with the speed of a man who had been waiting his whole career for an archive entry that would matter, after the citadel had settled into its nighttime stillness. Urin found me there an hour after midnight. She stood beside me at the rampart's edge and looked out at the red-gold sky and the mountain silhouette, and she did not speak for a while, and neither did I. "It's different up here," she said at last. "I've been in this citadel for 19 years, and I've never stood on this rampart." "It's reserved for the Alpha King and his household," I said. She glanced at me, and there was humor in it. "I suppose I'm household now." "You suppose correctly," I said. Another quiet stretch. The wind moved along the rampart's edge, cold and clean. "What happens next?" she said, "practically." The council will have questions and Doran will answer them from the records, and there will be formal documentation to complete over the next several weeks. None of it requires anything of you beyond being here. I paused. And the bond that takes whatever time it takes. I meant what I said. Nothing is required of you that you haven't chosen. She nodded slowly. I'd like to keep working, she said. In the Citadel. Not the torches, perhaps, but I'm not suited to simply waiting for things to come to me. No, I said, I didn't think you were. Is that, she stopped, is that acceptable to a Luna? You're the first Valthorn Luna in 400 years, I said. I think you get to decide what that looks like. She seemed to turn that over. I'd like to work with Doran in the archive, she said. He seems to know where everything is and also seems to enjoy company. He'll be delighted, I said. He's been working alone in there for 12 years. She smiled at the mountain. Then she said more quietly, I keep thinking about my mother. She carried that name her whole life without telling me what it meant. I don't know if she knew herself. The record suggests the name was told to each generation as something to protect, I said, not as something to understand. She may have known it was old. She may not have known what it was old for. She brought me here, Urin said, to this citadel when I was 6. She paused. I wonder if she knew. I did not have an answer for that. I thought she might not need one. I thought she might simply need to wonder about it, which is a different thing, and requires not resolution but company. I stood beside her on the rampart while the blood moon moved across the sky, and after a time, when the cold had gone from biting to simply present, and the mountain had gone from dark bronze to a deeper shade of itself, she shifted slightly, and her shoulder came to rest against mine. She did not comment on this, neither did I. My wolf, who had been a stone in my chest for 11 years, was not a stone now. He was something quieter than that and more permanent, the feeling of a door left open to the warm room, air moving in and out freely, the way something locked feels when the key has been found and does not need to be turned anymore. Just present, just at ease, just there. In the weeks that followed, the Citadel changed in ways so quiet that most people did not notice them until later, looking back. Urin spent her mornings in the archive with Doran, working through the records with a focus that the old archivist described, with some awe, as surgical. She had a memory for detail, and a way of finding the thread between scattered records that Doran said he had been trying to develop for 40 years. She continued to tend to the Citadel with the same attention she had always given it, not from obligation, she said, but because she had always cared about it and saw no reason to stop. The household staff, who had worked beside her for years, treated her with a slightly careful reverence that she seemed to find genuinely funny and gently deflected at every opportunity. The Lords came back for the formal documentation session 3 weeks after the blood moon. Lord Keed was the one who sat across from me in the council chamber and said, with the particular plainness of a man who has decided to be honest, "She is not what I expected." "No," I said, "she isn't. She's competent, Doran speaks well of her work, and she carries herself." He seemed to search for the word, quietly. "Yes," I said. He looked at his document. The seal was unambiguous, he said, and it cost him something to say it plainly, and I gave him credit for saying it. "It was," I said. "Then Valthorn has its Luna." He set the document down, signed, "I'll take my leave." He paused at the door. "For what it is worth, my lord," she woke the seal in a gray work dress while carrying a torch. "That is not nothing." "No," I said, "it isn't." The formal mate claiming came on the evening of the autumn equinox, 6 weeks after the blood moon, in the great hall with the torches blazing in the sconces, and the council in attendance, and the household staff in the back gallery, where they had always stood for formal ceremonies. Urin had chosen a dress that was not the gray work dress, and not the court silks that Marit had set out, but something in between, a deep, plain blue that suited her, and she had left her hair down, which was unusual for her, and she stood in the front of the great hall with the same composure she had in the lower corridor and on the rampart, and in every other place she had ever stood. When I came in with the cloak and the formal mate words, I saw that her hands were still, and her eyes were on me, and there was no fear in them and no performance, only the same clear, complete attention she gave everything. I spoke the words of the claiming. The hall was very quiet. When it was done and the council acknowledged it, and the citadel was officially on record as having a Luna for the first time in 400 years, I said, because the formal words were finished and these were only mine. I have been a practical man my whole life, and I made my peace with the idea that the seal might never wake. I want to tell you that I am very glad to have been wrong. She looked at me. I am also glad, she said, that I tripped. Something in the hall shifted, the specific sound of people deciding, very quietly, to let go of something they'd been holding. And I thought just then of a torch tucked under an arm, and a corridor too narrow for two people abreast, and a scent that had no name. She was not what anyone had expected. She was exactly what 400 years of a sleeping seal had been waiting for, in a gray work dress, carrying torches, moving through the citadel she had loved without knowing it was hers. I offered her my arm, and she took it, and we walked out of the great hall together while the citadel my ancestors had built from black stone and centuries of devotion stood quiet and present around us. And for the first time in my reign, the weight of it felt less like obligation and more like home.